E nā rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Simon, for the opportunity to speak tonight. As Simon said, my name is Jay, and I'm going to talk about this idea of dislocation in the age of connection. And to talk about some of the challenges that we're experiencing in terms of the global refugee crisis, both here within New Zealand and further abroad. I'll talk about that myself as a scholar, but also the research center, the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies, that I've got the honor of co-directing. So just to put this into context, from 1990 to about 2010, the number of forcibly displaced people in the world due to conflict and persecution was relatively stable. And then since 2011, we've seen a sharp increase in those numbers due to the Syrian civil war, what's happened in Ukraine, Myanmar, and now also Gaza. This report was produced in 2022, and actually, if we were to look at those numbers today, it would be 130 million people, an additional 22 million people, which actually would be 30,000 people a day, 2,500 people over the course of this event and the following. And so thinking about those challenges and some of the ways in which we've tried to respond to them, it became really clear to recognize that within that there's just the sheer diversity of what constitutes a refugee. And so to give an example of that, following the Canterbury earthquake sequence, we spoke to about 130 people from refugee backgrounds around their experiences of the earthquakes. And talking to men, creating word clouds around what they were talking about here, you can see that the men, yes, were interested in the earthquake, but they're more interested in sort of civic-based experiences and how they could support their communities. If you look at the women, the women are talking about the men, but the men aren't talking about the women. And also that there's more relational-based experiences around the earthquakes. If we look at older community members, the community becomes more central. The earthquake becomes larger, and the English language becomes important, because we're not just talking about 4 big earthquakes. There are more than 10,000. So the ways in which we think about responding to the refugee problem needs to be intersectional. And some of this work was used to inform the ways in which Red Cross even trains newly arrived refugees in terms of how they do disaster risk reduction. So one of the challenges around this is the power of dominant stories. And one of the things that I would argue is that through political commentary, media representations, and indeed even the academic literature, that the predominant way that refugee lives are understood is through the lens of trauma. And whilst that's really important, it needs to be honored, dignified, and recognized. If that's all that we see, what are we missing behind those labels? And what might that mean for people's opportunities to participate as peers in civil society in New Zealand? So working with a team, we've done a range of things around trying to understand that and to extend that beyond that trauma-dominated lens. And so working with the integrated data infrastructure, we've identified 25,000 refugees over the last 20 years to look at a range of settlement outcomes. To show the importance in that golden triangle there around the importance of the first 4 to 5 years of settlement. That's where the biggest settlement shifts and positive outcomes occur. After that, things start to level out. And yet all too often our settlement support ends after 1 or maybe 2 years. We've been able to show that a university education helps, but only after being here for more than 8 years. So it's only not about what you know, it's who you know, and the importance of belonging and social cohesion. We've been able to show that there are differential and discriminatory settlement pathways for the ways in which refugees come to New Zealand and how we've responded to that and worked with government and civil society organizations to change policy. We've worked with organizations. All those dots are organizations that provide refugee settlement support. And what you can see is they're not connected. It's showing that we have a highly resource-constrained and competitive funding environment that doesn't allow organizations to collaborate and work together to respond to these issues at a national scale. We've been able to show that where refugees are settled is largely where they end up, even 20 years later. And oftentimes they are settled in areas of highest deprivation, and that persists. So again, the importance of a good start. And ultimately this work is about trying to think about the ways in which settlement support, yes, it might be available, but is it accessible, is it adaptable, and is it acceptable? And so some of the things that this is related, some of the work that we've done, and obviously this has been working with people from refugee backgrounds, civil society organizations, is that for the first time, the refugee resettlement strategy is inclusive of all refugee groups, that asylum seekers are funded by the government for the first time, that we now have a seat at the table helping to inform what is settlement success and what are some of the indicators and measures that we use to inform that. But also our work extends beyond Aotearoa. And I would actually argue that for many of you, you've probably reached into your pocket, grabbed your phone, checked it, and didn't even know it. Because in many ways, the ways in which particularly social media and these applications are part of our lives, they almost escape examination. They're part of the everyday. And so when I talk about sort of refugees in New Zealand, that's less than 1% of the world's refugees. And oftentimes they're thinking about the 99% that are in other places around the world. As a way of illustrating that, a woman did a digital ethnography, and a woman from Rwanda spoke about how she used to wait for one fax message a year that would provide an update about what was happening to her family. She now wakes up every single morning with 200 WhatsApp messages from the Rwandan diaspora talking about a whole range of things. So it fundamentally has reshaped the ways in which we are social. And this opens up opportunities to think theoretically and pragmatically about the possibilities of transnational settlement, of effectively connecting the 1% here to the 99% there. And what might that mean for clinical work and practice and translation, for language acquisition, education, employment, disaster risk reduction, alongside some of the very real reservations that these tools also afford. So ultimately, this work that we're doing, and it's not just about me, is the power of possibility. And that recognizing that for us, knowing the world is not enough. It's actually about how we respond to those things and how we try to transform research into impact, and yes, working in transdisciplinary ways, but try to do that in ways with connection to then work towards amplification and then activation so that we're able to respond to some of those challenges of forced migration within New Zealand and beyond. Kia ora.